Hello and welcome to the Customs House Museum Monday Morning Podcast. I'm your host Shay, and unfortunately our membership director Harriet Sylvie was not able to join us today, but we are lucky to have with us Amy Lewellen, who is our Curator of Collections, and she's going to be telling us all about the history of our beautiful and unique 1898 Customs House building. Thank you for being here with us today, Amy.
Thank you.
So let me start by asking you this. Where did the name Customs House Museum come from?
Well, the original 1898 building was used as a federal customs house. We had the thriving tobacco agricultural market here and the river traffic that was taking all the tobacco to other cities to be sold. And so the customs house was where all the farmers would pay taxes on the imports and exports. The building also was used, however, as a post office, and a lot of the newspapers and things from the 1890s and early 1900s often call the building the Federal Post Office, or simply just the Federal Building. But the Customs House, I think, just sounded better when we came up with a museum title, so that's why we refer to ourselves as the Customs House Museum now, is looking back on that history of what the building used to be.
And I've heard people, both who have lived here a very long time and those who are visiting from out of state, comment on how unusual and different the building is from anything they've seen. Is there a story behind its architecture?
Well, the architecture is a mixture of Romanesque, Gothic, Flemish, and Renaissance Revival styles. And that's quite a number of styles to try to mash all together. And that's why it looks so totally unlike any other building. But actually, at the time when the building was being constructed, there were a lot of people who had the same thought, that this is really strange. And there's a quote from the time referring to the building as an architectural absurdity and a public laughingstock.
So there was quite a bit of controversy over it.
There was some controversy. There were actually three different architectural plans that were drawn up for the building. The first plan was rejected, and then what we have now is the second plan. But there was, as we said, quite a bit of controversy. One of the things was just, it was very unusual and people weren't sure if they liked it. But another point of controversy is that the building is 1.5 stories tall, and it's across the street from the courthouse, which at the time was 2.5 stories tall. And there were people who felt that it was inappropriate that the federal building should be smaller than a building that's county level building. So they thought that we needed a more impressive, larger building here. So they actually made up a third plan that was going to be a 2-story building that would be larger. And they got the money and the approval for it, but in the end decided to go with the second plan anyway, so they continued with what we have today.
So then the building was really the center of town, being the federal building.
Well, in the 1890s, the federal buildings were being built all across the country. So the Tennessee Congressman, Joseph E. Washington, was the one who proposed a bill to Congress in 1891 asking for $35,000 to build the federal building here. And so bought the land, decided to build the building, and yes, it was a focal point in town and was kind of commensurate with what was going around in the rest of the country, that towns of similar size were all building these federal buildings.
And who was the architect for the Customs House?
The architect for the project was William Aiken, who was actually the supervising architect for the U.S. Treasury Department. Because since this is a federal building and the money was approved by Congress, then the U.S. Treasury Department was the one who created the plans and approved the plans. So Aiken is the one who drew up the 3 plans, and he also drew the plans for, or oversaw the plans for, many of the other federal buildings that were being made across the country. He's also known for having done the Tennessee Centennial Exhibition in Nashville. So the original Parthenon, before it was remade more permanent, he was also in charge of designing that. So he had done quite a lot of design stuff, as well as the federal building in Clarksville.
That's quite impressive. Little did he know the challenge that he would be facing when he came here.
Well, actually, despite the controversy, William Aiken considered the Customs House building here in Clarksville, with this beautiful view overlooking the river and its striking architecture, he thought it was one of the most picturesque buildings he ever had a chance to work on. So he was really proud of it. And I think that's kind of neat. Out of all the many projects he did. One of the other things that Aiken was known for was designing things using local materials, and some of the design aspects, like having this steep roof, was the thought that when you get snow, that the snow comes off more easily. And so it was something that he would do in more northern designs and buildings that were in places farther north. So, but other materials such as marble from Knoxville, cement from Louisville, which not too local, but somewhat, and white oak that was from in the interior was from Clarksville itself. So he gave some thought as to what local materials were available, and then how to enhance those materials to use for the construction of the building. So one of the other important people involved in the project was Charles Moses, who was a contractor from Chicago who came to oversee the project. And using outside contractors was actually a fairly new thing in the 1890s, because it was only in 1897 that Congress passed the Tarsany Act that required all federal building projects to be bid out to find the best bid, just like what we do now. But previous to that, they just had someone they worked with, and that's what they did, and they didn't have this process. So Charles Moses came down as the most appropriate bid to oversee the project. He was greatly praised for hiring local laborers as the masons and the carpenters and the stone cutters and day laborers. So as a internal project, it was helping Clarksville's economy, hiring all these local men. And he also used some of the other construction supplies of lumber and bricks and things like that. He would try to acquire locally also. So he was highly praised for being both a reasonable overseer, but also someone who was working with the community, so that way it was a building that was both visually the center of town, but also something that many citizens would have put sweat into to build it.
So how did the federal building come to be the museum that it is today?
Well, the federal building was used as the customs house and as the post office until 1939. In 1939, the federal government sold the building to the city of Clarksville. So from 1940 through 1982, the building was actually used as the Clarksville Department of Electricity. So during that time, they put in the drop ceiling. There's a gorgeous ceiling that you can't see, although we hope to be able to show it at some point in the future when we're reconstructing. But they put in this lower drop ceiling with fluorescent lights and took out a lot of the interior decoration of wall paneling and things like that. And they also built a back garage area that is where we now have Memory Lane. So that was actually built during the mid-20th century while it was the Department of Electricity. Also, during that time, in 1972, the Clarksville Federal Building was put on the National Register of Historic Sites. And so when some of the local citizens started thinking that we really need a museum for this great city of Clarksville, then when the city decided to vacate the building, they agreed to lease the property to the newly started Clarksville-Montgomery County Historical Museum. And the museum was born in 1983 and opened in 1984 using that old building. And originally it was just that one building. So there was a tiny office space, there was, the tiny gift shop space, and everything was all in what we now have as Heritage Hall. And it wasn't until 1996 that the rest of the museum was added as an expansion to give more gallery space, to give more office space, more storage space, so we could present a whole lot more, but still be able to have this piece of history.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful history lesson of the Customs House building. We really appreciate you being here with us today, Amy.
Thank you for having me here.
And that's going to do it for episode 4 of the Customs House Museum podcast. We hope that you'll join us on December 19th for episode 5. And until then, have a wonderful week.